Dry Fork, Arizona Territory, February 1882. The road doesn't greet a man, it tries him. Frozen ruts, sage clawing the axle, a mule's breath turning white. Before we ride farther, do a small kindness. Like this video, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe, so these frontier stories keep finding your firelight. This is a tale about a man who came west to vanish and found more than silence. Today, his name was Caleb Vance, 42, quiet as a shut door. The war taught him habits he couldn't unlearn. Grief hollowed the rest. In Missouri, he laid a wife and a baby into frozen ground and listened to nights with no answer. Folks say you either find something to live for or somewhere to hide. Caleb chose the second and paid cash for a patch outside Dry Fork, a sagging shack, a rib-boned barn, and the promise of no questions. The barn looked like a rib cage the sky could whistle through. He pushed the door, and it answered like an old judge, slow, unimpressed. The soldier in him kept a palm near the revolver, even as his head said there was nothing here worth fearing but time. Nothing moved but an old halter swaying from a beam. Then the hay breathed, too smooth, too still, then undeniably alive. He saw the child before the blade, a girl, maybe 3, wrapped in a shredded blanket, eyes wide with a silence too old for her years. Behind her a shadow rose, crouched and steady, Apache woman, hunger thin, alert as a deer that knows what men mean. A dull knife steadied in her fist like a promise. They measured one another in a held breath. Caleb did not draw. The child's gaze pressed against ribs he thought were all ash. Something in him, the father part buried with his daughter, stirred and would not lie down. He knelt slow. From the inner fold of his coat, he drew bread, the last of morning ration, and set it between them like an offering. He backed out of their winter with the care of a man leaving a cliff. On the cot, he counted his pulse and considered the easy roads. Fetch the law, pretend he'd seen nothing. Keep being alone. Instead, he chose a habit: return, repair, repeat. Next day, he patched leaks with scavenged tin, laid fresh straw and tacked canvas where the east wind slid like a knife. Night by night, he left beans, potatoes, venison when the traps were kind. Each morning, the bowls came back rinsed and stacked, proof more fluent than talk. He kept to himself. Secrets blow across counters faster than dust. The distance shortened by degrees. The woman watched his hands instead of the door. The child sat up to see him. He heard a name hummed under breath, Nidita, and stored it where a careful man keeps what matters. On the 4th morning, a sound met him at the threshold. Not a word, just curiosity and bare feet. The mother scooped the child back, but he had seen it. The reach. Coffee came next, then names traded soft as tinder. Caleb. Nidita. He asked only what mattered. Anyone hunting? You. And when her answer carried raids, death, and miles, counted at night, his resolve set like a post in good earth. He would not be the thing she ran from. He would be the stop. Work became their language. She learned wood grain and nail bite. He learned the economy of her hands. When their fingers met over flour, the spark wasn't lightning. It was a lamp in a room long shut. Little Ayani's cough loosened, color returned, and the cabin, once a museum of loss, began to smell like broth and warm cloth instead of sorrow. The world noticed. A writer named Rudd came with questions meant to pry. Caleb stood in the doorway and lied clean, hadn't seen anyone. Rudd rode off. Caleb cleaned his rifle and cut a firing slit in the barn wall anyway. Promise takes the shape of preparation. What he wouldn't name was the ache-changing key, not absence now, but purpose. By the thaw, Ayani would drowse by the hearth and mumble a word that bent the room on its hinge. Papa. No one corrected her. The silence after wasn't uncertainty. It was agreement setting into bone. So that's where we begin. A man who meant to disappear inside a wreck. A mother who learned to hold a blade. A child whose breath turned a cabin toward living again. Out here, love doesn't dress for church. It comes as patched roofs, clean bowls, and a back turned to give you space to be afraid until you aren't. Keep your eyes on the ridge. The next rider will force a choice, and on this land, such choices make families or graves. The bread on the dirt floor was only the first step, a wordless pledge that Caleb Vance hadn't meant to make, but couldn't take back. He could have turned away and let hunger finish the work that the wind and the cold had started. He could have gone to town, told the deputy, let men with badges and guns decide what ought to be done with an Apache woman and her child squatting in a barn that wasn't theirs. But something in the girl's wide, unblinking eyes pulled him back from that edge. They looked too much like Clara's, the daughter he'd buried years ago, eyes that had trusted him to keep her safe until fever made a liar out of him. That likeness hurt, but it also held him steady. So instead of locking the barn and keeping to his cot, Caleb found himself patching the holes in the roof with sheets of tin salvaged from the shed, spreading dry straw over the mold-darkened corners, setting his traps harder so he'd have meat enough to leave at the barn door. He told himself it was practical work, a way to keep the barn from collapsing altogether. But deep down, he knew he was doing it for them, for Nidita, whose hollow cheeks hid a strength he recognized, and for Ayani, whose thin cough softened each day as warm broth replaced cold snow in her belly. At first, it was all distance and silence. He left beans and potatoes in a dented tin, and by morning the bowls came back rinsed, stacked, and waiting. That kind of careful return spoke to him louder than words. It told him she was cautious, respectful, unwilling to take more than what was freely offered. And slowly, he began to notice changes only a watchful man would catch. The way her eyes stayed on his hands instead of the door, the way she allowed the girl to sit up more each time he entered, the way her shoulders shifted from sharp vigilance toward a guarded kind of endurance. Caleb was a man who counted details the way other men counted coins, and he couldn't miss that they were no longer treating him as threat alone. The child even toddled once to the threshold, a wooden spoon clutched like a charm, cheeks glowing with new color. That small reach was nothing to most. But to Caleb it was a sign, fragile, tentative, that trust could sprout even in frozen ground. It was in those moments that Caleb felt the past and present colliding. His hand still twitched towards the revolver when shadows moved too quick. The old soldier's reflex drilled by years of war. But he found himself fighting a different instinct now, the urge to close distance rather than hold it. He didn't want to scare them, didn't want to press them, but he wanted them safe. He caught himself counting how many nights of firewood he had stacked, how long the venison would stretch, how soon townsfolk would notice he was buying for more than one mouth. Questions rose like fence posts in his mind. Who had chased them here? What did they run from? How long did they mean to stay? But he swallowed them down. Better to show what sort of man he was by what he did than by demanding answers. The first time they shared coffee, it was more ceremony than comfort. He knocked, not knowing why, maybe because the simple act marked a change. She cracked the door, but didn't shut it when he offered the mug. He stepped into the barn and found it warmer than before, a fire pot glowing low, a pot of beans simmering. Ayani sat wrapped in blankets, playing with string, while Nidita poured coffee into a smaller cup and passed it to him. They sat in silence, but it wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was a silence that made room for breath, for presence. When he asked her name, she said it plainly, Nidita. And when she asked his, he answered without hesitation, Caleb. For a man who thought he'd buried every chance of family, those two names in the same space felt heavier than any vow he'd ever spoken. From that point forward, the days no longer blurred into one another as they once had. Caleb began to notice not just survival, but the faint stirrings of life returning. Nidita touched the flour sack he left with her bare fingers, her eyes holding his for a heartbeat longer than before. Ayani's cough waned, replaced by a small laugh when she pulled at his beard. The barn, once a ruin, smelled of food and fire instead of mold and rot. And Caleb, sitting by his own stove at night, realized he was no longer counting the hours alone. He found himself imagining what they might need tomorrow: boots, a blanket, sugar for coffee, rather than just what would carry him through another day. What had begun as a hiding place for the broken was becoming something else. Something neither of them had asked for, but both of them needed. In his chest, grief and duty began to trade places, shifting like the weight of a rifle passed from one shoulder to the other. He could still feel the ghosts, his wife, his daughter, but he also felt something new, something he hadn't dared allow in years. The beginnings of belonging. It was fragile, yes, and uncertain, but it was real. And as winter dragged on, Caleb understood that he had crossed a threshold. He wasn't just feeding strangers anymore. He was returning on purpose, not because pity demanded it, but because part of him already knew he wanted them to stay. The silence between them began to bend, not break. After names were spoken, it was a shift, so small most men would have missed it. But Caleb Vance was a man trained to notice the flicker of a match on a battlefield, the twitch of a horse's ear before a shot rang out. He noticed how Nidita no longer kept her knife in her hand every time he stepped near, how Ayani's eyes no longer froze wide like a cornered fawn, but blinked slow, curious, alive. And Caleb felt that old ache, what it meant to watch a child lean toward him instead of shrinking back, stir in his chest like embers given a breath of wind. It linked straight to the moment he'd set bread on the barn floor, to the days he patched leaks without asking for thanks, to the coffee they'd sipped side by side in the barn while beans simmered low. He had thought it was enough just to keep them alive through winter, but now life itself was seeping in, warming edges he had let freeze over years ago. The language between them was still spare, a handful of words, a nod at the right time, the careful rinse of a tin cup, returned by morning, but it carried more weight than long speeches. Work became their bridge. Where talk failed, a hammer blow or a strip of leather tied around a post carried meaning. Caleb showed her the grain of the wood, how nails split if driven crooked, why support needed to rise from the bottom up. She listened with the stillness of someone who had learned long ago that watching was safer than speaking. And when she tried her own hand at the fastening a beam, fingers quick and deliberate, Caleb felt something like pride stir in him. Not ownership, not superiority, but the plain respect one worker grants another. In his world, Skill and steadiness spoke louder than bloodlines. She had both, even half-starved, even worn thin from hunger and fear. And when she caught his eye over the leather strap and didn't look away, he knew she understood the exchange. It was Ayani who changed the air more than anyone. Children carry truths grown folk try to bury. And she carried hers straight into Caleb's lap. One morning, Nidita stepped into the cabin, shawl pulled tight and set about the fire with a practiced hand. Ayani toddled close, climbed onto Caleb's knee as if she'd been doing it her whole life, and reached for his beard. Caleb stiffened, the old wall inside of him rattling, but he didn't set her down. Her small weight rested on him like a promise, and when her laugh bubbled soft as spring water, something in him cracked and let light through. That laugh carried him back to Missouri, to Clara's breath on his cheek, but it didn't gut him the way memory used to. Instead, it gave him a reason to stay seated, to steady his arm around a child who was not his but might yet be. Nidita noticed. She always noticed. She saw the way his hand lingered on the child's back, not tentative now, but firm. She saw the way his eyes softened when Ayani leaned against him, the way his breath steadied as though anchoring himself. And something in her own guard eased. She had survived long enough to know the difference between men who took and men who gave. Caleb was not reaching for what wasn't offered. He was holding what had been placed on him freely. And that was a difference worth more than food, more than shelter. It was the difference between a hiding place and a home. When words did come, they carried weight. Sitting across from one another at the hearth, steam rising from tin cups, Caleb asked if anyone was looking for her. The pause was long, her voice halting. But she told him of raids, of families scattered, of running until Ayani's fever slowed her feet. He did not press further. He only listened. And when the telling ended, he answered with something more binding than comfort. He asked if she still wanted to leave. She shook her head, admitting she did not know, but Caleb already felt the truth settle heavy and clear in his chest. He didn't want them gone. That realization frightened him less than he expected. It felt, in fact, like the first honest thing he had admitted to himself in years. That night he brought a pair of boots for Nidita. Small, sturdy, better than the worn moccasins she'd clung to. She traced the stitching, her fingers pausing as though the gift itself was foreign. When she lifted her eyes to his, they held not suspicion, but something quieter. Trust, and maybe a question she wasn't ready to speak. Caleb didn't need the words. He saw enough in the way she stood a little straighter, in the way she carried herself the next morning when she walked toward the cabin instead of waiting for him at the barn. She came not to ask, but to help. She stirred the stew while he chopped potatoes, wrapped the child in her shawl, and set her down near the fire as though she belonged there, because she did. By mid-March, thaw cracked the frost on the ground, and wild flowers, frost-bitten but stubborn, began to bloom along the fence line. Caleb heard humming near the trough and found Nidita teaching Ayani to press stems into cloth, making beauty out of what little the land had spared. She looked up when he came, not flinching, not hiding, and held the cloth high enough for him to see. "Spring," she said. The word felt heavier than any prayer for Caleb. It was proof of what he'd begun to suspect, that grief, if given the right ground, could grow something new. He brought her a bucket without asking why she wanted it, and she smiled. A small thing, almost lost to the wind, but enough to mark a new season between them. That smile lingered with him long after. It carried him through evenings when silence filled the cabin, not with loneliness, but with presence. It carried him through nights when Ayani's breathing deepened into steady sleep at the hearth, and Nidita sat with coffee cooling in her cup, watching the fire the way a woman does when she knows she has survived what tried to kill her. And it carried him through the moment Ayani, half asleep, whispered, "Papa," and no one corrected her. Caleb met Nidita's gaze across the room, and in that look was agreement. Not spoken, not formal, but binding all the same. What began with a piece of bread in the dirt had become something he could no longer deny. He was not alone, and neither were they. The word Papa had settled in the air like smoke that doesn't clear, changing the shape of everything, though no hand had moved to stir it. Caleb carried it with him the way he once carried a rifle, weighty, steady, a reminder of both danger and duty. The morning after, nothing was said, but he felt it in every glance, every step, every quiet act. Nidita didn't linger at the barn anymore. Instead, she stood by the porch when he came back from town. Ayani perched on her hip, her small hand waving without fear. That sight, simple as it was, anchored him in a way he hadn't thought possible. For years he had lived among ghosts. But now, the living were waiting on him, trusting him to return. And that trust, unspoken but undeniable, mattered more than the rifle he leaned against the cabin wall or the coins left in his pocket after a trip to Dry Fork. It was a covenant deeper than law or paper, forged in hunger and firelight, and it bound him to them with a strength he no longer wished to shake off. In town, though, he felt the eyes. The general store clerk weighed every extra pound of sugar, each bolt of fabric, with suspicion he didn't voice but let hang in the air like a noose. A man living alone wasn't meant to buy for more than one mouth. Caleb kept his answer short, his gaze fixed, his tone flat. He'd survived the war by learning when to speak and when to stare, and this was no different. Let them think what they wanted. He knew what truth waited for him on the homestead, yet under his composure ran a pulse of unease, not for himself, but for the fragile circle he'd drawn around Nidita and Ayani. He understood better than most how rumors could travel faster than a bullet, how the wrong word in the wrong ear could bring riders to his door. That knowledge sharpened his resolve. If trouble came, it would not find them unguarded. Back home, the cabin no longer echoed. The air carried the smell of boiling meat, of rags washed and hung to dry, of a hearth that didn't fade cold before morning. Nidita moved through the space differently now, not as a guest or a shadow, but as someone who knew where each bowl belonged, who stirred the fire without asking, who set Ayani's cot closer to the bed, as though claiming her place required no permission. Caleb watched her sometimes, not with hunger or pity, but with a kind of wonder he couldn't voice. She was alive because she'd chosen to fight for it, and now she chose to stay. That choice was more powerful than any vow a preacher might have wrung from them. It was enough for him. The quiet between them thickened, but not with distance, with presence. He found himself speaking in fragments, testing words he hadn't used in years. She answered the same way, spare but honest. Over coffee one night, she asked if he still thought of his wife. He didn't lie. Yes, he told her, I did and I do. But love for the dead didn't mean life with the living had to end. Her eyes lingered on him, raw but steady, and he saw she understood. She told him then, in the same plain way, of her cousin tied to a post, of her uncle killed, of the man she stabbed when he tried to take her. Her jaw had been hard as stone, but when she looked up, there was no defiance in her, only the quiet plea of a woman who wanted to be believed. Caleb's fists tightened at his knees, and when she asked if he was angry, he told her the truth. "I'm angry they made you run." That answer softened her in a way no comfort could have. It told her he carried her pain not as judgment, but as shared burden. It was after that night that things shifted further. He brought out a tin box he hadn't opened in years, the one that held his late wife's comb, a broken locket, a blanket from their daughter's crib. He didn't explain, didn't need to. He simply set it near the fire where Nidita could see. She touched none of it, but she noticed. Later, when she sat beside him brushing ash from the stove, their hands met and didn't pull apart. The firelight played across her face, and he reached slow and deliberate to touch her cheek. "I already do," he whispered when she asked if he wanted someone. And she leaned forward, hesitant but steady, lips meeting his with more recognition than desire, as though both of them were finally giving in to what had already been true. From then on, the nights changed. She didn't return to the barn. Her shawl hung beside his coat, her daughter's small things folded in drawers that once held only grief. Ayani slept between them sometimes, her tiny hand resting over theirs, as if to bind them together. For Caleb, the cabin, once a tomb of memories, breathed new life. For Nidita, it was the first roof she'd chosen to trust since the raids. For Ayani, it was simply home. And though no words of permanence had been spoken, each gesture said enough. She stirred his pot, he mended her boots, the child called him Papa without correction. They were no longer surviving side by side. They were becoming a family, piece by piece, without fanfare, without witness, but with a certainty stronger than any paper bond. Yet even as the warmth grew, Caleb's soldier's mind stayed sharp. He knew peace on the frontier was borrowed, not owned. He rose before dawn to walk the ridge, rifle across his chest, eyes scanning for dust on the horizon. He cut new firing slits in the barn wall, cleaned his weapons with care, stacked wood higher than ever before. He didn't tell Nidita all that churned in his head, but she understood. She spent more time inside the cabin, teaching Ayani to trace letters in the dust, grinding corn with steady hands, making dolls from folded rags. The rhythm they settled into was simple, quiet, but also ready. Caleb knew that love out here wasn't about declarations. It was about preparing the ground, building the fence, keeping the fire hot, and being willing to stand when riders came. And though he didn't speak it, he carried a promise inside him as sure as steel. If the world tried to take them, it would bleed for the attempt. The days that followed carried a rhythm steadier than Caleb Vance had known in years. But even within that rhythm lay the weight of watchfulness. He had told himself from the start that silence and solitude would be his salvation, that work on the land was enough to keep the heart from collapsing in on itself. Yet now he found that silence had a different sound. It was no longer the silence of an empty shack or a grave remembered in the Missouri soil. It was the quiet hum of a woman moving about his cabin, the light patter of a child's feet across the planks, the low crackle of a fire tended by more than his own hands. And though he didn't voice it, he understood the shift. The home was no longer his alone, and for the first time since loss hollowed him out, he was glad of it. Still, that gladness was tempered by the hard edge of caution, for the frontier had a way of punishing anything that looked like peace. He rose each morning with the rifle close, eyes scanning the ridges, ears listening for the telltale thunder of hooves. Love, he was learning, was not a soft thing here. It was vigilance, readiness, and the grit to protect what you could not bear to lose again. Nidita had sensed it too. She did not ask about his early rides, or the way he walked the fence line twice where once would have done. She did not question the extra wood stacked high, or the way his eyes lingered on the horizon before he came in at dusk. She understood a man's silence because she had lived inside her own long enough. Instead, she filled the cabin with her own language. Rags folded into dolls for Ayani, corn ground fine against stone. The soft murmur of old songs half remembered from her mother's voice. Where Caleb guarded from without, she tended from within. And together, those unseen labors began to weave a fragile net of belonging. For Ayani, it was a world she could laugh in, a place where her cough had turned into chatter, where her hands reached not out of desperation but curiosity. To Caleb, each sound from the girl, each laugh, each call of Papa, was both gift and burden. It reminded him of Clara, yes, but it also reminded him that he'd been given another chance. And chances like that demanded you stand ready to bleed for them. It was during one of those afternoons, the air thawed enough to smell of wet earth and pine, that Nidita came to him by the trough with a strip of cloth pressed full of wildflowers. Their edges were frostbitten, yet still they held color. She looked up at him, unafraid now, and raised the cloth for him to see. "Spring," she said. The word was plain, but it carried more weight than any sermon. Caleb, who had thought winter would bury him like it had his past, felt something in his chest shift again. He nodded, unable to shape words of his own, and went to fetch the bucket she asked for without question. That was how their bond deepened, not through declarations, but through the unspoken ease of one moving for the other without hesitation. Inside the cabin, the same pattern held. He would chop potatoes, she would stir the pot. Their hands brushed and neither pulled away. She would mend his shirt, and he would lay a folded blanket beside her without comment. These were not gestures of charity or transaction. They were the slow, careful binding of two people learning to trust in labor, not in promises. And when night came, they sat side by side in firelight, silence no longer heavy but alive, a shared breath between them that spoke of survival earned and survival chosen. The memory of her confessions lingered with him, the cousin tied to a post, the uncle slain, the run that stretched across frozen nights. Her voice had not trembled when she spoke it, but Caleb had felt rage stirring in his gut all the same. Rage at the kind of men who made a woman carry a child through snow with death at her heels. Rage at the thought that she believed herself ruined by such a history. He had told her he was angry they made her run, and he meant it. That fury, sharp and cold, fused with the warmth he was beginning to feel for her. Together, they formed a resolve as steady as iron. Whatever else the land or its riders demanded, Nidita and Ayani would not be made to run again. And so, he prepared, not with bluster, but with the kind of quiet diligence that defined him. The rifle was cleaned nightly. The barn wall bore new slits for watching, for firing if it came to that. He made his rides at dawn, marking hoof tracks, measuring dust trails, listening to the hush of the hills like a man attuned to scripture. Nidita did not question, but she understood. She stayed closer now. Her shawl hung beside his coat. Her daughter's toys scattered across the floor where once there had been only emptiness. The cabin, once built for grief, was no longer waiting for loss. It was braced, steady, alive. Yet for all the caution, moments of gentleness bloomed between the labors. One evening, after Ayani had fallen asleep near the fire, Nidita stood at the window, her voice low. "If they come again, bounty men, I fight. I don't run." Caleb had stepped to her side, laid a hand on her shoulder, and answered with the weight of a vow. "Anyone comes here meaning harm, they won't get far." She turned, eyes lit by fire and something more, and when he kissed her, it was no hesitant brush, but a steady claiming, not of ownership, but of choice. That night they made room for one another, not in haste, but in permanence. Her belongings came inside. Her child's cot moved near their bed, and the shawl she once carried like armor now hung as part of the home. For Caleb, each shift in the cabin's shape pressed deeper into him than words could ever reach. He knew now that the silence he had once thought would keep him alive had only been a slow death. It was the sound of another's hands working beside his, the laughter of a child safe by the fire, the murmur of a woman unafraid in his presence. That was what life demanded, and what he would not let be taken again. Out on the ridge he still watched the horizon, still kept the rifle near, but his heart no longer belonged to grief. It belonged to the two souls who had turned his shack into a home. And he carried that truth like a weapon, sharper than any steel. The promise he spoke at that window, steady as iron, low as fire in the grate, did not end when the words left his mouth. It followed Caleb into every hour of the day, shaping his steps as much as the rifle at his side. He knew the frontier had little patience for dreams of safety. Yet he also knew that men could carve out small bastions with grit, vigilance, and will. Each morning before the sun cracked the ridge, he walked the lines of his land, breath steaming in the cold air, ears tuned for the faintest rumble of hooves or the echo of voices carried by wind. The cabin behind him was no longer just a refuge for one man's grief. It was a harbor for 3 lives. And for that reason his caution sharpened. Where once his silence had been the mark of a man waiting for the end, now it was the language of readiness, a vow to defend what had rooted itself in his chest. He still recalled the night Nidita declared she would fight beside him, not run. Those words gave him strength, but they also reminded him that he could not allow danger to cross their threshold unchecked. It was his duty to stand before it, to bleed before they did. And he wore that duty like a second skin. Yet even beneath that vigilance, warmth had begun to pool in places long left cold. Inside the cabin, he found himself softened by rhythms he had not dared hope for. Nidita moved without hesitation now, her hands steady as she ground corn or stitched fabric at the table, her shawl resting on the peg beside his coat as if it had always belonged there. Ayani's laughter filled corners once heavy with silence, her small feet tracing paths across the floorboards, her voice calling Papa with a certainty that left no room for doubt. Each time the child's eyes met his, wide and trusting, Caleb felt the fragile shell of his old life crack a little more, making room for something sturdier to grow. It was a dangerous thing, this hope, dangerous because it gave him more to lose. But it was also the truest reason he'd had in years to keep his boots steady and his rifle close. The land itself seemed to sense the change. The wind carried sap and thaw now instead of bitter frost, and the oak by the barn began to bud. Caleb worked the fence line with a persistence that surprised even him, repairing posts, tightening wire, setting new rails. He told himself it was for the livestock he might one day keep, but in truth it was for Nidita and the child. A strong fence, a patched roof, a stocked larder. These were not just chores, they were bulwarks. Small walls against the chaos he had seen too much of in war. And as he worked, Nidita often joined him, her questions about wood grain and nail bite carrying a quiet eagerness that made him pause. She wanted to learn, not because she doubted his strength, but because she imagined a future in which she might build something of her own. Caleb heard the hope behind her careful words, and though he rarely smiled, he carried a quiet pride in her resilience. In the evenings, the fire cast them in a circle of light that felt earned, not granted. They spoke little, but when they did, it was of truths that mattered. She told him of her mother's teachings, half remembered and scattered by raids, while he told her of his father's farm back east, where the rows of corn stretched straighter than soldiers on parade. These fragments, humble as they were, stitched a fabric between them stronger than the silence ever had. And in those moments, Caleb realized that he had not just opened his door to strangers, he had invited a future into his life. Still, the world outside did not rest. He knew Rudd's knock had not been the end of things. Men like that, with polished revolvers and questions they felt entitled to ask, did not let go easily. Caleb's memory of Rudd's eyes, flat, deliberate, unwilling to blink, reminded him daily that more riders might appear on the horizon. He kept the rifle cleaned, its weight familiar in his hands, and cut firing slits in the barn wall wide enough to cover both yard and ridge. Each night he walked the perimeter before bed, boots crunching on thawing soil, every sound catalogued, every shadow measured. It was not fear that drove him, it was resolve. The cabin, the barn, the patch of land, they were more than a hiding place now. They were a claim, and claims had to be defended. Nidita did not try to temper his caution. Instead, she matched it in her own way. She spent more time within the cabin walls, teaching Ayani new words in Caleb's tongue, showing her how to grind corn with steady circles, how to trace shapes in the dust. She wove strength into the child as surely as Caleb built strength into the land. And in their shared work, his outward, hers inward, they created a balance. The home became not just a shelter from cold, but a space where all three of them could grow roots. One evening, as Ayani slept bundled near the fire, Nidita turned to him with a steadiness that startled him. "If they come again," she said, voice low but sure, "I don't run." I fight. Caleb had heard those words before, but this time they carried the weight of a vow, not just a declaration. He laid his hand on her shoulder, felt the strength in her frame, and answered the only way he knew. "Anyone comes here meaning harm, they won't get far." The kiss that followed was not the hesitant brush of two souls testing boundaries, but the sure meeting of those who had already chosen one another. That night, they lay side by side, hands entwined, and for the first time in 5 years, Caleb slept without the ache of emptiness beside him. In the days that followed, their lives settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary, though Caleb knew better than to call it safe. The cabin no longer bore the mark of a man waiting to die. It bore the mark of a family willing to live. Nidita's belongings folded neatly into drawers, Ayani's toys scattered across the floor, the shawl hanging beside his coat, all of it spoke to permanence. And Caleb, who had once come west to vanish, now rose each morning with purpose written into his bones. He would guard this place, guard these lives, not as penance for what he'd lost, but as devotion to what he'd been given. The land had tested him, grief had hollowed him, but here in Dry Fork, in the company of a woman who refused to flinch and a child who called him Papa, Caleb Vance had finally found something worth the fight. The land was quiet in those first weeks after, but Caleb Vance did not mistake quiet for safety. He had lived long enough to know the difference. Quiet was the space before a storm broke, the pause when riders reined in their horses just out of sight. Safety was a word men spoke in saloons, but out here in Dry Fork, it was a lie that didn't hold water. So he moved with the caution of a soldier and the steadiness of a farmer, his eyes sharp, his ears tuned, his hands never far from the rifle propped by the door. Yet beneath that vigilance was a new weight he carried with purpose rather than dread. The cabin wasn't just walls of pine and a roof patched with tarred canvas anymore. It held lives. Nidita's shawl beside his coat, Ayani's wooden dolls scattered underfoot, the smell of stew bubbling low while a woman hummed old songs by the fire. These things made the silence different now. Not hollow, but full. And it was that fullness he would not surrender, not to Rudd, not to any man who came riding out of town with law in his pocket and greed in his eyes. The memory of Rudd's visit lingered sharp as barbed wire. Caleb could still see the way the man studied the barn, could still feel the weight of those eyes, flat and unblinking. He had lied clean, told him no one had come through, but he knew such men did not leave their suspicions at the trail's edge. They carried them back to town, let them grow like weeds, until one day they returned with more riders, more questions. That truth did not rattle Caleb. It hardened him. He had seen worse than Rudd in the war, men who came with torches and steel, men who thought fear gave them right. He had outlasted them then, and he would again. Yet this time it wasn't just his own life. He weighed in the balance. This time it was Nidita and the child. That sharpened his resolve, turned each small act into preparation. The rifle cleaned, the barn reinforced, the fence line walked twice at dawn. He wasn't waiting for trouble. He was readying to meet it. Nidita saw the change in him, though she didn't name it. She had her own way of answering danger, with stillness, with watchful eyes, with the quiet tending of her child. She moved about the cabin as if it had always been hers, no longer glancing toward the door each time the wind shifted, no longer clutching her knife at every creak of the floorboards. But Caleb noticed the subtle tightness in her hands when she kneaded dough, the way her breath hitched whenever hoofbeats echoed faint across the hills. She was strong, unyielding even in her weariness. But she knew as well as he did that the world was not done with them, and yet she stayed. Each night she pulled Ayani close by the fire, her dark eyes flicking to Caleb across the flames. And in that gaze was a choice made plain. She would not run anymore. Not from him, not from this place. It was that choice, unspoken but clear, that gave Caleb a new kind of strength. He had once thought himself a man emptied out, a vessel cracked and drained by loss. But when he saw her standing in his doorway, Ayani balanced on her hip, waiting for him to return from town, he felt something settle into him that no war and no grave had managed to give. It was belonging, fragile but undeniable, and with belonging came defiance. He would not bend to Rudd or to any rider who thought to pry into what was his. Not because of pride, not because of stubbornness, but because of the life that had taken root under his roof, a life that deserved defending. The day the riders came again, he felt it before he saw them. Dust lifted on the horizon, faint but steady, the kind that spoke of hooves not wandering but aimed. 3 men this time, Rudd among them, the long black coat cutting a dark line against the pale ridge. Caleb met them before they reached the yard, rifle slung across his chest. Body set with the quiet certainty of a man who had already decided what he would give his blood for. The exchange was spare. Questions asked, denials given, suspicion pressed against resolve. Caleb did not yield. He blocked their eyes from the barn, held the line at the trail, and made clear with every word and every silence that they would not pass. When they finally turned and rode on, leaving only hoofbeats fading into wind, Caleb did not celebrate. He simply walked back to the cabin, jaw set, knowing the fight was not ended but delayed. Inside, Nidita stood at the table, knife poised over carrots, her hand trembling despite the mask of calm on her face. Caleb reached for her hand, stilled the blade, and told her the truth, plain. "You don't need to be afraid anymore. We're not running." She looked at him then, really looked, her eyes searching his, as though to test whether his words were stone or smoke. When she saw the answer there, her breath eased, her shoulders loosened. "Then I stay," she said. It was not a plea, not a hope, but a declaration. And Caleb, steady as bedrock, answered with the only truth that mattered. "You already have." That night they buried Ayani's first blanket beneath the cottonwood out back. It wasn't just cloth. It was a marker of where they had come from, a token of what they had left behind. Nidita tied a strand of her own hair to a twig, pressed it into the soil, and whispered words Caleb did not understand but felt in his bones. It was a ritual of remembrance, a way to honor the past while letting it rest. And as he stood beside her, the child's hand tucked into his, he realized the ground beneath their feet had become more than dirt. It had become theirs. For a man who had once ridden west to disappear, Caleb now understood that hiding was no longer an option. He had been found not by lawmen, not by death, but by life itself, by a woman's choice to stand, and a child's unshaken trust. And with that came a clarity he had not known since before war and fever carved him hollow. The land would test them again. Of that he had no doubt. But whatever came over the ridge, whatever men rode under dust and badge, they would not face it as 3 scattered souls. They would face it as a family, bound not by blood nor by law, but by bread shared in hunger, fire kept through cold, and promises spoken in the kind of silence that lasts. The cottonwood, where they buried the child's blanket, stood like a witness, its roots now holding a piece of their past, its branches stretching toward the sky as if to remind them that nothing grew without being tested first. Caleb felt the weight of that earth each time he walked by, a steady reminder that they had chosen not to run, that they had planted themselves here with intention. And though the riders had turned back down the trail that day, leaving only dust and suspicion behind, he knew the world would not simply forget them. That was fine by him. He had made peace with the kind of man he was now. One who did not seek fights, but one who would not bend when they came. His war had left him with reflexes that never faded, but it was no longer just habit that made him sharpen the rifle or cut sight lines into the barn wall. It was devotion, pure and simple to the woman who moved freely through his cabin now, and the child who laughed as though the world had never meant her harm. They had tied themselves to him as surely as he had to them. And in that tether lay both risk and redemption. Inside, the shape of their days grew steadier, almost ordinary in a way that startled him. He would return from the ridge to find Nidita at the stove, Ayani tugging at the hem of her skirt, with flour on her cheeks. The air no longer smelled of dust and grief, but of meals shared, of leather mended, of blankets hung to dry near the fire. Her shawl hung beside his coat now, as if it had always belonged there, and the small chest he carved for their things sat at the foot of the bed, lined with flannel and marked with a bird Ayani had pointed to with wide eyes. These were small things, but on the frontier, small things were what proved life was being lived. He had buried too many to mistake them for chance. This was not chance. It was choice, carved out of hardship, nailed together with quiet acts of care. Yet beneath the rhythm, the memory of Rudd's cold eyes lingered. Caleb knew the man would not forget the barn he'd been refused entry to, nor the lie he'd been told with a steady voice. Men like him carried grudges like coins in their pocket, ready to spend them when it suited. And so Caleb did not let down his guard. Each evening before sleep, he checked the rifle by the bed, walked the cabin walls with an ear tuned to the night wind, and watched Nidita as she tucked Ayani in, her hand smoothing the child's hair with a tenderness that made his chest ache. He carried that sight with him like armor, because it reminded him what he stood for, what he would bleed to keep. Nidita had said once, "I stay because of you." He knew the truth was sharper than that. She stayed because they were safe with him, and he meant to see it remained so. Still, safety was not all they built. There was laughter now, soft, shy at first, but real. One morning, Ayani clapped her hands when he lifted her onto the small stool he'd built at the table, her voice piping Papa with no hesitation. Caleb caught Nidita's gaze across the room then, and the look they shared said more than words could. For Nidita, it was the confirmation that she had chosen right, that this man who could have turned them out instead had made space for them. For Caleb, it was the realization that his grief no longer ruled every corner of his heart. Clara was still there, as she always would be, but Ayani's laughter did not wound him anymore. It healed. It filled cracks that had felt beyond mending by late spring. The land itself seemed to echo their change. The snowmelt fed the creek, and green shoots broke through the thawed soil. Caleb turned the earth near the cabin, hands steady on the plow, while Nidita dropped seed in careful rows. Side by side, they worked without need for much talk, and when the sun dipped low, they sat on the porch, Ayani playing at their feet, the sound of the wind carrying nothing but the promise of another day. That was how belonging took shape here. Not in grand gestures, but in sweat shared, in soil turned, in the hum of a woman's song rising into dusk. But the memory of danger never left entirely. It was there in the way Nidita still paused when hoofbeats carried across the ridge, in the way Caleb's hand tightened on the rifle before he even thought of it. It was there in the way Ayani sometimes woke from sleep, whimpering until Nidita pressed her close. These shadows were part of them, stitched into their past, but they no longer ruled their steps. Instead, they sharpened their resolve. When Nidita whispered one night that if men came again she would fight, Caleb answered with a vow of his own. They won't get far. He meant it with the weight of everything he had lived through. He had seen death up close, felt loss hollow him out, and now he understood the cost of keeping what you loved. and he was ready to pay it. The cabin reflected that truth. No longer a place of hiding, it bore the marks of permanence. Nidita's woven cloths lay across the table, Ayani's toys scattered like seeds across the floor. The fire never died cold anymore, and the bed no longer felt built for one. Yea, each night Caleb reached across and found her hand, rough from work yet steady, and felt the truth settle again. He was no longer alone. The war had left him cautious, grief had left him hollow, but love, quiet, unspoken, hard-won, had made him whole again. Out here, where storms rose without warning, and riders could appear from the horizon with the weight of law or blood on their side, the only certainty worth clinging to was the one you built yourself. And Caleb Vance had built it. A home, a family, a life forged out of silence and choice. He did not know if Rudd or men like him would ride back one day. He only knew this. Should they come, they would not find a man waiting to vanish. They would find a man who had something to stand for, something to protect, something worth the fight. And that made all the difference. For the first time since Missouri, since fever carried his world into the ground, Caleb looked to the horizon and did not see an ending. He saw a future, steady as the oak by the barn, rooted deep, branches reaching higher with each passing day. The future Caleb glimpsed on that horizon did not come with fanfare or sudden revelation. It came the way dawn comes to the high country. Quiet, patient, laying its light over frostbitten earth until even the stubborn shadows begin to lift. Life in the cabin steadied itself into a rhythm, not perfect but real. He woke each morning to the sound of a child breathing steady by the hearth, and the soft shift of Nidita moving about the room. Her presence no longer tentative but sure. Her shawl still hung beside his coat, but now it was joined by a dress she had mended from scraps and a pair of boots he had found in town. Each object, humble as it was, marked a claim not written on paper but carved into their daily living. Caleb understood better than most that the frontier recognized no law but choice and survival. And here, beneath his patched roof and by his tended fire, Nidita had chosen to stay. Ayani had chosen to laugh. And he, though he hadn't said it plain, had chosen to stand as their anchor. That knowledge filled him with a quiet pride, but also a sharpened edge of responsibility. Love on the frontier wasn't soft words, it was labor, vigilance, and the willingness to defend what had been hard-earned. Their evenings bore witness to that truth. Nidita cooked with what little they had, turning beans and venison into meals that smelled of more than sustenance. They smelled of belonging. Caleb chopped wood by the stove, the rhythmic bite of the axe carrying through the room as Ayani sang little songs she learned at her mother's knee. Sometimes Nidita would hum along, her voice low, steady, filling the spaces where grief once lived. Caleb, who had thought silence would be his lifelong companion, found he did not mind the sound. It did not scrape against his wounds as he once feared. It healed. He realized that the quiet he had lived with before had been a kind of death. This noise, soft, unhurried, full of ordinary life, was the sound of living. And though he rarely spoke of such things, he carried the awareness deep. Like a man shouldering a rifle, he never meant to set down. But peace, he knew, was only ever borrowed. The memory of Rudd and his riders lingered like storm clouds that hadn't yet broken. Caleb could still see the suspicion in the man's eyes, the way he glanced at the barn as though its sagging walls hid more than they showed. That memory reminded him each day that trouble might return. So he prepared. The rifle stayed clean, The fence line stayed watched, the barn fortified with hidden slits that could serve as windows for lead should the need arise. He did not speak of it often, but Nidita saw it all, the way his jaw set as he scanned the ridge, the way his hands never left the rifle for long. She didn't try to stop him. Instead, she matched his resolve in her own way, teaching Ayani words in Caleb's tongue, showing her how to hold a spoon, how to help grind corn. In her care, the child grew stronger, steadier, ready in her own small way. Together, they built a balance. His watchfulness against the world outside, her tending to the world within. The cabin itself bore the proof. It was no longer the shack of a man hiding from memory. It was alive. The hearth glowed warm, not from habit, but from need. The table bore marks of use, knives cutting, bowls scraped clean, a child's toys scattered like seeds. Even the bed, once a cot of grief, now carried two lives that had chosen to share it. Each night when Caleb lay down, he reached across and found Nidita's hand, her fingers calloused but steady. That simple gesture told him more than words. They were bound not by law or preacher, but by choice made day after day. Yet choice alone did not blind them to what might come. One evening, as Ayani slept, Nidita stood by the window watching the hills darken into shadow. "If they come again," she said, her voice low but firm, "I don't run. I fight." Caleb stepped beside her, laid a hand on her shoulder, and answered the way a man must when his soul is already tethered. "Anyone comes here meaning harm, they won't get far." He saw her eyes steady on his, not pleading, not doubting, but meeting him as equal. When their lips met that night, it was no hesitant brush. It was a seal. The bond they'd been building out of bread, fire, and silence found its final shape. From that night forward, the shift was plain. Her things were folded in drawers beside his, her shawl no longer a visitor's token, but a fixture of the home. Ayani's cot pressed close to their bed, her small body curled safe within reach of both. Caleb felt the weight of permanence settle over the cabin. Not heavy but grounding, like stone laid deep in a foundation. He had once thought permanence was something stolen from him in Missouri, when fever carried his family to the grave. Now he understood it differently. Permanence was not guaranteed. It was chosen, built, defended each day. And with Nidita and Ayani beside him, he found himself willing to defend it until his last breath. Still, he did not let hope soften him into carelessness. He kept to his dawn rides, his perimeter walks, his careful scans of the horizon. Trouble might come again, that was certain. But now, when he returned from those rides, the sight waiting for him was enough to silence doubt. Nidita on the porch, Ayani clapping her hands, the smoke of their hearth curling into the sky. It was not just survival anymore, it was home. And in that home, Caleb carried a truth that made his heart steady as the cottonwood's roots. He was no longer a man living among ghosts. He was a man living among the living. And that, more than his rifle or his caution, was what gave him the strength to face whatever storm rose next. The story of Caleb Vance does not close on a sudden shout of triumph or the sharp crack of rifles. It ends the way a frontier life is meant to, slowly like dawn spreading across a cold valley, lighting up the frost and proving that even after long nights the land still holds warmth. He had come west with no thought beyond disappearing, carrying the weight of a war and the hollow ache of graves left behind in Missouri. He thought solitude would be his shield, that silence would be his balm. Yet what he found in that sagging barn was not the end he expected. but the beginning of something that remade him piece by piece. And as the seasons turned, as snow softened into thaw, and green shoots pressed through stubborn soil, he discovered that a man could choose life again, even when he believed it was long past choosing. By the time summer settled over Dry Fork, Caleb was no longer the lone figure walking his fence lines with only ghosts for company. The cabin bore proof of change in every corner. A woman's shawl hung steady beside his coat. Ayani's small toys were scattered on the floor like seeds, and the table showed the wear of many shared meals. These were not tokens of chance. They were evidence of permanence, of roots taken in ground once thought barren. Each sound within the cabin told the truth of it: the soft laugh of a child, the low hum of a woman at her work, the creak of floorboards carrying more than one life. Caleb, who had thought he'd buried all claim to family, now found his evenings filled with it. And though he rarely spoke of such things, the steady warmth in his chest said enough. He was no longer empty. The shadow of danger had not vanished. He knew men like Rudd might return, knew the world beyond his ridges still had a long memory and a hunger for those who lived outside its lines. But Caleb no longer met that threat as a man resigned to loss. He met it as a man with something worth the fight. His rifle was kept clean, his eyes sharp, his body ready. But the fire that drove him was not vengeance, it was devotion. Devotion to Nidita, who had once held a knife between them but now stood beside him in equal measure. Devotion to Ayani, whose voice calling him Papa cut deeper into his heart than any blade ever could. Devotion to the home they had stitched together from scraps of hope and shared labor. These things bound him firmer than any soldier's oath, and they gave his life a clarity he had thought lost forever. What made their bond strong was not just need, but choice. He did not claim Nidita out of pity, and she did not cling to him out of desperation. Piece by piece, through silence and work, they revealed themselves to one another, and in that revelation found belonging. She stayed not because she had nowhere else to run, but because she no longer wished to. He opened his door not because he felt obliged, but because his heart, though scarred, was still capable of welcoming her. And in Ayani's small hands, reaching for both of them, the choice became complete. They were a family, not one born of law or preacher's vow, but of bread left on a barn floor, of roofs patched in bitter wind, of trust earned when trust seemed impossible. As summer ripened, the land answered in kind. The garden sprouted strong, rows of green breaking the monotony of dust. The barn stood straight under its patched roof, no longer a ruin, but a place of shelter. Caleb built a stool for Ayani, small and sturdy, and watched with quiet pride as she clapped her hands to sit at the table like she belonged there. Nidita, steady and patient, taught her to grind corn, to trace letters in the dirt, to laugh without fear. These were not grand victories, but they were the kind that lasted. Caleb knew well enough that glory fades, but small labors done with love endure. Each day that passed, he saw endurance in their hands and heard it in their voices. At night, when the fire snapped low and the world outside held its breath, Caleb would sometimes lie awake with Nidita's hand resting over his. He would listen to the slow rhythm of her breathing and the softer one of Ayani's by the hearth. Those sounds, ordinary and unremarkable, carried more meaning than the roar of any battlefield. They were the proof that life had been wrestled back from grief, that a man who once thought himself finished had begun again. And in those hours, he would allow himself something he had denied for years: peace, not the fragile kind that comes when danger withdraws, but the kind that roots itself in trust, in presence, in knowing you no longer face the world alone. The cottonwood behind the cabin, where Ayani's first blanket lay buried, stood taller with each passing month. Its leaves whispered in the breeze, carrying memory and promise together. To Caleb, it was a marker, not of sorrow, but of transformation. The graveyard in Missouri had held his past. The cottonwood in Dry Fork held his future. Every time he looked upon it, he was reminded that loss had not been the final word. Life had spoken again, in the form of a woman's steady eyes and a child's bright laughter, and he had answered. And so the tale closes not on Caleb's solitude, but on his belonging. He was no longer the man who rode west to vanish. He was the man who stayed, who built, who defended, who loved. The war had left its mark. The fever had carved its wound. But the frontier had offered him a chance to begin anew. And he had taken it. In the end, Caleb Vance did not disappear into the silence. He rose out of it, carrying with him the weight and the gift of a family he had not expected, but had been given all the same. And under the wide Arizona sky, with the ridges guarding his land and the cottonwood standing sentinel, he finally lived not as a shadow of grief, but as a man who had chosen life, love, and home